I just have to set the stage here because Scott comes into the podcast studio with coffee. Okay, I have a coffee too. And
Recently had a guest who's talking about his family.
he comes to the podcast studio with coffee and 2 little baggies of cookies. Then he proceeds to open the cookies and put them straight on the table, no plate. And now he's eating these little cookies that I thought were for our children when they came to the office.
Why would you think that?
I assumed they were a children's snack. So anyway, if you hear crunching, it's Scott eating
They're soft cookies.
a handful of soft cookies. So if you hear
Lip smacking?
Yeah.
What did you say?
I don't know. I'm cold, okay? Our office, the heat's not working today. And so once again, I'm complaining about the cold because it's very chilly in here today.
And this morning was what, minus 20? Which is minus 4 Fahrenheit.
Yeah, so it's a bit much. It's a bit cold today. Scott's eating cookies, no plate.
Okay,
And
I did not want to add anything extra into the studio.
Can we
That
see?
would-
Can we get the cookies on? No, you can't see the cookies.
No, don't touch the camera because
Yeah. Well, this will be on video, right? So people can see you eating cookies. Anyway.
that's if Jordan doesn't cut it out.
Yeah.
What was I supposed to do? I'm a hungry boy, first of all.
Can you not call yourself a boy?
Why?
Like a hungry little boy?
Does it make you feel weird to be married to a hungry boy?
I cannot with you. Welcome to Robot Unicorn. We are so glad that you are here. As always, let's start the show with a question from Scott.
I'm in a mood right now.
I know.
that-
Scott's in a mood and I'm a little nervous about it.
Yeah.
It's because the cold. It's because we're freezing.
Is that
so
what
our
it is?
adrenaline's
Maybe-
pumping to keep us like...
Maybe that's why I feel alive today versus other days. It's so warm in here that I feel like I'm just going to hibernate and
Well, you know what
I
it
need to go to
is?
sleep.
You know what it is? You know, people take cold baths to like get their energy flowing and all this. We're essentially living in a cold bath. So whatever the benefits of a cold bath is, that's what we're living every single day. So that's why you feel so much energy.
I thought that whole thing was disproven. No,
No, okay, I don't know if you want to get into that, but were they lying to us about it?
oh, I see what you did there. That was a terrible segue. What do you think the record is for the longest amount of time it has taken us to get into the actual?
I just sit here and
Episode
wait, and you
topic.
just keep talking.
Yeah, no, because usually it's you that talks at me. At key word in that sentence. Okay, today's episode is on lying, and I feel like Jess is the perfect person to talk on this.
Okay, simmer down.
What? Are we
right.
even going to be able to get through this episode?
I don't know. This feels like a group project. When I was in university, we had to do like a mock counseling session, and my friend and I were like doing it together. And it probably took us like 4 hours because every time we hit record, we just started giggling uncontrollably. And
I think I still have your mock
yeah.
session on my phone because you recorded it with my phone for some reason.
Yeah, anyway, this reminds me of that. Okay. Ask me a question. Let's get into it.
Sorry, now my mouth is full with cookies.
Also, like the amount of cookies that you had in that pile. Why don't we just finish the cookies and then we'll restart.
No, it's fine. I'll save it for the few times that you start talking, you go on one of your monologues, then. Okay, getting back into it. Today's episode is on lying. I won't make any comments now, but we should really get it. Jess, take this seriously, please.
I'm still thinking about your comment before. Just as a perfect. Okay.
Why did we originally choose this topic? I can't even remember now why. Like, were people asking you about
This is a really common question that people ask me is about lying. And I feel like it's because, well, kids do lie.
Yep.
And that's actually developmentally appropriate, normal. But I feel like it causes a lot of panic in kids and parents. Like as soon as their kids start lying, they're like, am I raising a sociopath? Why is my child lying so much? So that's why we wanted to just kind of get into it and really answer some questions to help parents understand lying better.
Okay, so let's just start off with the term lying. Mm-hmm. How should parents, first of all, understand or think about the term lying versus, I don't know, like, is there another label for it if they're quote unquote lying, but it's because that's a part of their stages of development? Is it still the same thing? I don't know. Because I feel like we have this term lying, and kids obviously will lie. That's just a part of them growing up and testing boundaries. But I don't know. It seems like we use that term, but that could mean that, I don't know, some politician is lying to us or a family member has lied to us, like an adult, versus when a child.
Why don't we start here? There's different kinds of lies. So I don't like despise the word lying, but I do think that there needs to be more of an understanding as to the different types. So let's start with one type of lying, quote unquote, which is their child is lost in imagination and they have a really hard time differentiating between what they imagined or wished for to happen or thought maybe could have happened and what actually happened. So for example, your child comes home from school and they're like, today at school, there was a tiger and the tiger was roaring and all the kids were scared. And you're listening, you're like, there's no way there was a tiger in your class that was roaring and all the kids were scared, right? So, but your child might say that and you might be like, well, you're lying. That's not true. That didn't happen today. Well, what's actually happening in that scenario is very common is that your child is having a hard time differentiating between imagination or what they wished for or what they were scared of that could have potentially happened and what actually happened in reality. And that's very common because that is true for children. Like they do have a difficult time differentiating between their daydreams and reality when they're reflecting back on what happened. And as your child gets older and again, kind of reaches that 5 to 7, 5 to 9 shift, you might see less of those type of quote unquote lies that are rooted in imagination. So that's one type of lie that parents will often worry about and be like, oh my goodness, my kid tells me all these stories and none of this is true. Well, your child's probably just having a hard time differentiating between reality and imagination land. The second type of lie a child will say is a lie that is your more traditional type of lie, right? So this is a lie to get them out of trouble or because they did something that they weren't supposed to do. And that type of lie actually takes a lot of skill. And I don't think we give kids enough credit because when a child is finally able to lie, like they ate a cookie and they weren't supposed to, it means that they're able to hold multiple truths at the same time in their head. And what this means is they can think, I ate the cookie and I know I ate the cookie. And I don't want my mom to know that I ate the cookie because she's going to get me in trouble. So I'm actually going to tell her I didn't eat the cookie so that I don't get in trouble. Like that's actually a lot of brain work for a child to do. And if your child is doing that, congratulations, your child's reached a new developmental milestone and they're going to try that out a little bit just to see what happens. And so again, that's a kind of lie that we kind of expect. And it usually starts like 3 to 4 around that age. And I remember our daughter specifically doing that. I remember the time she was juicing the chocolate. Yeah. She was not supposed to eat this chocolate Easter egg. And then she did still eat the chocolate Easter egg, but she licked it instead of eating it. So she's like, no, I didn't eat it. Meanwhile, there's chocolate like dripping off of her face. And mommy, I didn't eat it. I'm like, okay, well, what I'm seeing is chocolate dripping off your face. And she's like, well, I was juicing it. AKA she was licking it, turning it into juice. Which is the grossest thing ever. It was nasty. But again, in that situation, you might think, my child's lying to me. And they are. I'm sure we'll talk about ways to help them. But you want to also recognize that this is a skill. That means that they're holding multiple truths in their mind at the same time, which is actually great. So we just want to help them know that they can come to us with the truth. So those are, I would say, the two main kinds of lies that we see in our kids. There might be some other types of lies that you might notice, but you do want to ask yourself, where is this coming from? And that will help you understand your child a little bit more.
Right. And I think, I don't know, I feel like in theory, that all sounds great. But then when you actually have that happening to you directly,
it's very triggering.
There's kind of that, I don't know, a feeling of betrayal almost, that your child is lying to you and you provide everything for them. So why would they ever feel the need to lie to you, right? So how do you make sure you navigate that well as a parent so you don't break trust? Because I feel like if you, I don't know, I could foresee you saying, depending on how you handle it, could cause your child to lie to you more or less, depending on how the situation is handled. So it seems that what we want to do is make sure we're not breaking the trust with them, and that they actually eventually will come to you with the truth when it's developmentally appropriate. But I know with our daughters, I've been annoyed if they've lied to me and I know distinctly, hey, this is not the truth.
Yeah, I feel like for you, it's a bigger trigger than for me.
Yeah, for sure.
I clearly remember when our oldest started lying, and I think I didn't pass this information on to you right away. And I do remember when she would lie to you or tell you something that was not true, you would get quite angry right away with her. You're like, can't lie. And what I was going to say as a tip, and then that's why I was thinking about that, is the worst thing that you could do when a child lies to you is get angry at them and call them a liar. So it's just not a productive response, because now, A, you're getting angry at your child, so that leads to fear, which leads to more lying. B, you're labeling them a liar, so now it's like, okay, well, I guess I'm a liar. Meanwhile, let's say it was an imagination lie. They still haven't differentiated in their head if that actually happened or not, right? They haven't even found that truth themselves. And if it's a lie because they don't want to get in trouble, well, now they're getting in trouble, so they're going to be more likely to lie. So we do want to avoid things like yelling at kids for lying, punishing them for lying, and calling them liars. Now, this is the most classic Jess thing I've ever said, but we want to get curious about why they're lying.
No kidding.
Yeah, surprise of the century. Somehow get curious is the response to everything. And that doesn't necessarily mean, I just want to clarify this because I had this a few times recently. Getting curious does not necessarily mean you're asking your kid, why are you lying to me right now? I think when I say get curious, parents often think, oh, that means I have to start asking my kid a whole bunch of questions. Well, if you ask a 3-year-old, why are you lying to me? They're like, I wasn't lying. And then you're going to be like, yeah, you were. There was no tiger in your class. And then the 3-year-old's going to be like, no, I wasn't. There was a tiger. And now you're in a power struggle. So the better question would be to ask yourself, why do I think my child would say this? Right? And what need might this be serving? I tell a story on, here's my monologue. Where's your cookies?
I already ate them.
I tell a story on Nurtured First.
You want more, though?
I'm sure. I tell a story on Nurtured First about a time when our daughter lied to us about having breakfast. And I had said, have you had breakfast? And she said, no. And then I looked at the table and I saw her bowl of cereal was empty. And I was like, yeah, you did have breakfast. And then she hammered down on the lie. She was like, no, I didn't eat breakfast. And in my head, I was like, okay, you're clearly lying to me. Look, there's an empty bowl of cereal. Why would you do that? And I felt like I wanted to get angry at her and yell at her and be like, girl, you clearly ate breakfast. Stop lying to me. But I had to get curious. And so I thought to myself, I wonder why she would lie to me about eating breakfast. And the more I thought about it, then I was like, oh, you know what? We were planning to go to Tim Hortons for breakfast, but I think you had set out a cereal bowl for her. And she probably thinks that she's not going to get Tim Hortons if she already had breakfast. So I said to her, I'm like, what are you hoping that we're going to do this morning? She's like, well, I really want to get whatever it was from like a bagel from Tim Hortons. And I was like, okay. So do you really want to get a bagel? And that's why you told mommy that you didn't eat your cereal? And then she goes, like, her big eyes, like, yeah, well, I really want to have that. And Daddy just gave me cereal. I just ate it. And then I forgot that we were supposed to go to Tim Hortons. And I still really want my bagel. Right. And so in that situation, I got curious and I thought about, like, how is this lie serving her? And I found out the answer. And then we could talk it through and be like, next time you can still have your bagel at Tim Hortons, but you have to tell me the truth first when I ask you if you had breakfast. And then we had a whole conversation about that. So that's like one example of how you could get curious without necessarily like demanding your child tell you what happened.
Well, I've even noticed, because you briefly mentioned the 5 to 7 shift, I have even noticed in our 4-year-old who is getting closer to 5, how at the beginning of the school year, there was a lot more of those stories, imagination-based lies versus it seems like we can trust more of what she says now is actually the truth. So I find that interesting that she's able to, I don't know, it seems like something's clicked in her mind that telling the truth doesn't necessarily always mean that I won't get the outcome I'm looking for. Versus that seemed to be what the lying was kind of about, was I'm looking for a certain outcome to the situation, and therefore I'll tell the story that gives that best outcome for me.
Yeah, so that's another type of lie I guess I didn't cover. It's like a type of lie to gain control over a situation, right? So it might not necessarily be out of fear, but more so out of, well, I want to control what happens next. So if I lie about this, if I lie about having breakfast, I know I'll still get my second breakfast at Tim Hortons, right? So there's a piece of control. And again, that's huge. Like, that's incredible that our children can think of all of these things in their little brains. And about the 5 to 7 shift, like, you'll only see that, I think, when it comes to lying, if you are not yelling at them for lying and you're not using fear-based punishments and all of that stuff, right? It's not just going to naturally change.
Can we get into that? So the developmental role of lying, because you've kind of briefly touched on that a little bit. And I'm just wondering, at what age do you think we start seeing, like, when do we typically start seeing lying happening? When do they start moving away from that? And then is there a point at which, hey, this is slightly concerning and we need like a bit more help on this situation?
Well, first of all, your child has to be speaking before they can really be lying. I think I start to see it really in preschoolers, that age. So 2.5, like closer to 3, maybe to 5 is really like a key age for quote unquote lying, especially those imagination lies we see a lot more of, and some of those fear-based and control-based lies, like, no, I didn't eat the cookie. We see more lying in children. I mean, this is anecdotal based on my own practice, but I see more lying in children who are afraid of their parents. So if you're using a fear-based discipline, like you're yelling at your kids or spanking them, sending them away from you, you're going to see more lying because they're trying to avoid that happening, right? So again, that's how that type of discipline can backfire on you a little bit, because now your child's scared of you, so they're not going to tell you that they broke the lamp or whatever because, well, they know what your reaction's going to be. So I will say there's a developmental piece, but there is a piece that we do need to account for the way that we parent them. And that's why not every child makes that shift at 5 to 7.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I think as a kid, just based on how I grew up, I was quite deceptive because I was finding ways to get away from punishment.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I grew up and my parents, like, honesty was always a value. And I remember so clearly being young and like maybe having this impulse to lie, but my parents always being like, you know, in our home, we value honesty. Like, you can always come to us with the truth. So I never really felt this like deep need to lie to my parents.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's kind of stayed with me my whole life. It's like, I've never been one to be like, I want to lie. And lying has always been a hard one for me to understand. And so when I saw our kids lying for the first time, I'd be like, what? Like, we value truth telling in this house. Like, why are you doing this? So it was really helpful for me to understand that there is a developmental appropriateness to lying, and that will stop if we create that safe space. Now, children like you who maybe were afraid of their parents' reaction or didn't have that connected relationship where you felt like you could be truthful, it makes sense that you would be more deceptive and as a way to like get your needs met and also to avoid punishment.
I do actually want to get into that. I think closer to the end, because I wonder why I am so like I'm almost too honest at times.
Yeah. Let's get into that at the end. I think that
Because there's something there to do with lying, and anyways, we'll get into that after. I should probably have a pen so I can write that down. But okay, so when do you think a parent should be? You're saying like around preschool age, specifically when they're able to start talking, and that's when you essentially start seeing that they can lie. They have the ability to lie.
So at this stage, we're not freaking out about it.
Deceive us.
Do we want to talk about how to respond, or is that like later in your line of questioning?
Well, at this point, I'm mostly wondering, when should a parent be concerned about the lying? Because you've mentioned to me that you get DMs about, or even I think we've had friends come to us saying, my child is lying. They've like told me this thing, and it looks like they're incredibly serious about it, as though it's the truth, but I know for a fact they know it's a lie. So is my child a sociopath? Are they able to just lie to me straight in the face and feel no remorse for anything that they've just said to me?
So I'm less worried about your child being a sociopath, and what I am more worried about is the disconnection in your relationship. Classic, I know. So get curious and tune into the relationship, I feel like, as every single podcast episode. Anyway, But I am more worried about the relationship, especially as your kid's hitting that four still. I'm not super worried. It's very typical. But as we're heading into the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 age, and your child is intentionally lying to you, like, for example, they broke something and they're looking you straight in the eyes and like, Daddy, I didn't break it. And you're like, I know for a fact you did. That's telling me that we're maybe missing something in the relationship, that connection piece, that and not always. It could be something else.
That doesn't feel very fair, because I could still see our almost 8-year-old lying to us about breaking something. Like, maybe not anymore, but I could still see it, and I think we have a great relationship with her. She's past that 5 to 7 shift. So she's at that point where she can know, or knows that she has to be honest with us. We're not going to get upset with her, but it's still an embarrassment piece or something like that.
Right. So there's multiple pieces. To go back to what I was saying, the lying because out of fear, I think we do need to be mindful of that, because I do see that a lot, where parents, they tend to gravitate more to yelling at their kids and getting angry, and they've called them liars, and I'm not even, there's no shame to parents, because the first time our child started lying, we did the same thing. Like, we kind of just like went into panic mode, right?
Yeah.
So now they're at that 5 to 7 shift, and they're fearful of their parents' response to whatever they did. That's one reason why you might still see the lying.
I don't know. I feel like that's not the most fair thing to say, and maybe life's not fair, but it's not the most accurate thing to say, maybe, because I can still see our oldest would lie to us because she's fearful, not because we're going to be enraged with her or anything like that, but just because, hey, I broke this. Like, just imagine she was playing and she threw something and it broke the TV. Like, we're maybe not going to be the happiest with her, but we're not going to be enraged with her for doing so.
Yeah.
But she'll still be fearful because she had done that thing.
Right. So
but you think that's like our attunement or connection with her is not good enough in that case? Well, that's kind of what it sounds like.
I'm trying to say that there's multiple reasons. So the first one is fear. The second one might be their own internalized shame, right? And I think that's what you're talking about with our daughter, especially sensitive kids, but all kids, like our oldest is not highly sensitive, but like all children have a sense of shame when they do something wrong. And sometimes they need varying levels of time in order to feel like they can come forward. So I think sometimes too, one of the issues that we have as parents is like, we want them to tell us the truth like instantly, right? Like, what happened? Tell me exactly what happened. But maybe they haven't processed it in their own head yet. What's happened? They haven't thought it all through. And then they look like deer in the headlight. And then they're like, I don't know. I didn't do it. So I think that's another reason that kids can lie, is like that sense of shame or embarrassment that they might feel. And maybe they're unsure as to how you're going to respond. Like our oldest, she knows that we're not going to yell and scream at her, but she might know that we would be disappointed or frustrated. And even that can feel very, very tricky, right? So some kids, it might just take time, and their original thing they might tell you is a lie. But if you give them a little bit of time, they might just come to you with the truth. Mm-hmm. I've noticed that in a lot of kids I've worked with. Some of the coaching I've done with parents is like, if you know that they lied to you, right? So let's say they broke the TV and they said they didn't do it, and like there's no one else would have broke the TV. Give it some space. Don't call them a liar automatically. Like, give them some space, give them some time, and then come back and ask them again in a calm and quiet moment. And you'll almost always see that now that their brain's maybe not quite in fight or flight as much, you can have a conversation with them. So sometimes just asking them again a little bit later can be helpful. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so there's the fear, like the lies that happen because they're afraid of the parent. There's lies that happen because of their own shame. And then I think that there's lies that happen in this 5 to 7 age because they're worried they won't get what they want. So for example, our child lied. I guess she just omitted the truth to us when we were out with friends. Later, she told me that she threw up that night because she wasn't feeling good. Right. But she said she didn't tell me that she threw up that night because she didn't want to stop hanging out with her friend. So she did end up telling me the truth about what happened that night, but that was weeks later, and she felt a lot of shame about it. She's like, I really wasn't feeling good. I didn't want to tell you I threw up because I knew you would say that I couldn't keep hanging out with my friend, and I wanted to hang out with her. So sometimes lies happen, not because our child's like bad or manipulative, but because they're trying to do the thing that they want to do. So I hope that helps kind of explain. Like, I don't think every single lie a child does is rooted in fear of their parents. I think that there's multiple reasons, but I do think the fear of the parents is one that we need to ask ourselves if our child is constantly lying.
I see. Okay. That makes sense. I just wanted to clarify that because it kind of sounded like you're saying everything comes back to the relationship you have with your child. Mm-hmm. And although true, we're still humans and we have human feelings and emotions, right? Mm-hmm. So then, I don't know, I think you could have the greatest relationship in the world with your parent and still lie by omission or deceive them because for several other reasons.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, I think that's completely fair.
Lie to protect someone else from something too, right? Like, I don't think it's just because you have a terrible relationship.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Another thing that I've been thinking about recently is just because we had the holiday season recently, I feel like there's this contradiction where like Santa, Tooth Fairy, or whatever, different things, like somehow we as parents are allowed to tell our kids these things because there's, magic or whatever, this feeling, good feeling that comes along with them. But I see that as kind of a contradiction, especially over the past few years. I don't know. I feel
like you've been wrestling with that over the last few years.
Yeah. It doesn't seem very fair if I am allowed to tell my children these things that are blatant lies, but then the expectation is in return
they be truthful.
They have to be 100% truthful 100% of the time.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. How do you make sense of that contradiction?
I feel like I think Santa, the Tooth Fairy, is it the other thing, the Easter Bunny.
Oh yeah, I didn't have a bunch. I
Okay,
just had,
well, they could be fun in imagination land. Like, and I know that people disagree with us here, but for me, I'm like, hey, if you want to connect with your child through imagination and have them feel like a tooth fairy is coming into the room to take their tooth, and write them a little note and make it fun and make it imagination, that's great. But as soon as your child starts asking questions, like, I think if you want to create a culture of honesty in your home, I don't understand why we go so deep into lying to our children to convince them that it's real, to make that magical. Because I think it can be magical for kids just because it's imagination. So, for example, I've recently told our children that their toothbrushes are magical wands that turn them into princesses. And of course, they don't actually turn them into princesses, and the kids know that. Like, they're watching themselves in the mirror as they brush their teeth. But because it's imagination, they love it and they go right along with it. So now they're thrilled. They're asking me to brush their teeth every night because the magical wand that they brush their teeth with turns them into a princess. And then they get to go to sleep in their princess beds. And it's the best thing they've ever done. If they started asking me questions like, Mommy, am I really turning into a real life princess? And they start pushing back, I'm not going to be like, yeah, you're actually a princess. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like have fun with it in imagination, but also there is a point of honesty.
I feel like I've heard you talking about that though. And I've heard you say, let's use our imaginations. Your toothbrushes are magic wands. Like, so you're literally telling them this is using their imagination.
Yeah. And I would say the same thing about the tooth fairy. Like, let's imagine that tonight that a magical tooth fairy is going to come into your room and take your tooth and float it away. I wonder where the tooth fairy would go. And we could make up a whole world and it would be so fun. And they would love to pretend that we're the tooth fairy. And they would love to imagine that we float into their room and take their tooth and it goes to a magical cloud in the sky. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think it has to be done in a lie. I think because children are ruled by imagination and play, like, just you can just have fun with it and still do it, but not telling them like, hey, this is real, an actual fairy. You know what I mean? I just feel like there's a balance. So I don't think don't do it, but I think you can do it without lying.
Honestly.
Yeah. Does
Yep.
that make sense?
Yep. And this again goes back to my final question, which will be on why I'm so, maybe not strict, but very much against lying. We'll go to that after. Okay, so we're talking about imagination and lying, and I feel like often, especially with our, I don't know, with our oldest, she doesn't really do it so much anymore, but with our middle child, at the beginning of the year, she was, let's say, deliberately lying to us about situations that were happening at school. But I think part of that is just because at that age, you have this amazing creative brain that's coming up with, like, imagination and reality are so intertwined with one another that it maybe even feels real for her. So, and I think we often will default to punishing or getting angry, whatever, because they're lying to us about something that happened at school. Like, I think she talked about one time, one of the kids in her class ran into the parking lot and all the teachers had to go out and get the child to bring her back. And
we check
like,
in with the teacher. The teacher's like, no, that didn't happen.
yeah. And like, it sounded to me like what actually happened was just someone wasn't listening in class, and she doesn't love it when kids don't listen to the teacher in class. But she made up this whole imaginative, like a long story to discuss it. So I don't know, at what point do you go from thinking like these imaginative stories are kind of adorable? Because I feel like often with her. If you just let her talk, she comes up with the most adorable stories. Even her dreams are about unicorns, and she hates waking up because she's dreaming about unicorns. And going from like, oh, that's adorable that you've come up with this whole thing to, okay, we need to talk about this lying, and you're not being truthful with us, and we need to work on that.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a balance because especially with our very creative children, like I think, for example, the daughter you're referring to is highly, highly creative. And I feel like her brain is just constantly spinning with these ideas and these stories. And I remember as a kid, I had the same thing. And I'm still like that. Like I'm still constantly thinking of stories and ideas. And as a kid, sometimes it would get me into trouble because I would say a story of something that I think I convinced myself of was true. And my parents would be like, "Oh, that's not true, Jess. That never happened." I'd be like, "Well, wait, what? I thought it did. Did I dream it?" Like I genuinely remember them saying that and me being so confused. Like I actually thought that did happen. And I think that's the same thing with our daughter. And so some things that we can do are like helping them know what reality is, right? And be like, "Oh, that's a really cool story." Like that, if you know for sure, for a fact, like it did not happen, right?
Right. Well, I found with her, even though she's 4, the story, especially that one where the child ran into the parking lot and a whole bunch of
Yeah.
teachers had to go out and catch her.
Yeah.
That sounded
Very
very
true.
real to me. So we
And-
had to confirm with the teacher because it sounded so real.
And there's sometimes that you will have to confirm with the teacher, right? I think
Yeah.
with her specifically, we had multiple instances where we're like, we should probably just check in and make sure that that didn't happen, or just try and understand what actually happened. So there is a piece that if you have a young child, like it is okay to just check in and make sure. And then if it isn't real, maybe wondering with your child where that comes from, right? Because in that scenario, when we got to the root of it, she's just upset because there was a kid not listening in her class. So that made sense, right? And she made up this whole story.
Does it make sense? I don't know. Like, it's still hard for me to see the
connection.
Yeah, like I don't know, I kind of get it a little bit, but also in the same sense, that's a very out there story to tell us about someone who just wasn't really listening. So it's hard for me to...
In my head, and maybe this is just me overanalyzing it, but in my head, when there's this like big grandiose story and at the root of it is like this kid's not listening, or there's like something small at the root of it, they're just trying to show you how big
It actually feels...
that actually felt for them, right? I think it was a big deal for her to go into JK or whatever and have some, like, if kids weren't listening, because she just didn't have that before and maybe wasn't used to it. And I think wanted to express to us like how that felt for her, and that it started out in truth. Like, I feel like it started out like this child is running away. Okay, that was true. But then the rest of it got built on and built on and built on, because as she's telling the story to her, it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I think if we can, as parents, we can acknowledge what might be true in the story. It's like, wow, that was a big story. Okay, so what I'm hearing is someone wasn't listening. Do I have that right? You know, and so bring it back to like the basic of the story and see if you have that right or not. And what I would always suggest to parents is, if you know what's true, just name that. So don't try and, I think a lot of times we try and catch kids in the lie, right? Like we try and get them to tell us the truth. Same with like when our daughter had the chocolate dripping down her face. I know for a fact that she was eating the chocolate. Clearly it's dripping off her face, right? So the first thing we want to do is just name what's true. Don't waste your time trying to go back and forth, getting them to tell you the truth, because they're just getting more and more confused. Name what you know is true and then work from there. And if you don't necessarily know what's true, either, okay, I know that this wasn't true, it's a story, you know, name what you think might be the root of the story, or just be like, yeah, wow, that's a fascinating story about your day today, you know, and then try and get them. Sometimes what I'll try and do is bring them back to reality by asking them a question that I know they can give me a truthful answer.
Yeah.
Like, who was your teacher today? And then they tell you their normal teacher. Oh, okay. And who was the special student today? And then they tell you that, just to get their brain back into truth-telling mode and out of imagination mode.
Do you think there are any unexpected, like, creative gifts that we as parents should be, I don't know, not necessarily helping foster when it comes to lying. But I think with our middle daughter, I don't know. Even our oldest, she did the same thing at that age.
Yeah.
How can we make sure that the creative or imaginative aspects of that remain and we don't crush that out of them while we're also trying to
Name the truth.
yeah, stop them from being dishonest with us.
Yeah,
right? Because I think there is a lot of value in being creative.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want that to be removed from their abilities. I don't want them to all of a sudden not be able to be creative if we're trying to say, no, you have to be honest with us. You can't say things that aren't true.
Yeah. So if it's a lie that's rooted in imagination, right? So it's not like the I stole the cookie lie. It's a lie that's like they don't know what's true or not. I think you can name what you know is true and you can label the rest as story or, wow, you really imagined a lot happened today. Like you imagined a tiger was roaring in your class. Let's draw it out. Get them to draw it out. And I think the main thing is, and it goes back to what I said at the beginning, if you call them a liar and label them a liar and get angry at them and say, you have to tell me the truth, then it might make them question themselves and kind of crush that creativity out. But if we can just flip it, name what you know is true and help them find the truth and label the rest as an interesting, imaginative story and allow them to still think of stories. And I mean, I think this is where like the best writers come from, right? There's like, when you're writing something, there's something that's true. Even if you're writing like a fiction novel, there's something that's true. And then the rest is just your imagination that kind of takes over, right?
You build a whole story around it.
You build a whole story around one thing that's true. And so allow them to do that. Get them to write if they're old enough to write. Get them to journal. Get them to make a play. Get them to write it in a poem. So still allow that creative outlet while focusing on being like, in our family, we also make sure we tell the truth.
I have found that amazing with our oldest because over the holidays, she wrote a whole bunch of different plays that I had to be involved in. And she had lines for me and scenes. And she's setting up the scenes. And then she's also been writing her own songs, which like the lyrics are surprisingly pretty good for an 7-year-old. Yeah. 8-year-old. So that's the kind of thing that I don't want to, I don't want that to be crushed out of, let's say, our middle daughter who maybe does it a little more than she did. But I can tell there's just inherently this creativity that's involved, and you can tell her brain can create these immersive worlds that there's a positive aspect to that. And then for me, not demanding, but like needing people to be honest. I just want to make sure, especially for myself, that I'm not, stopping that part of it.
Yeah, I think just flipping it, focusing on what you already know is true, finding the truth, but then always still giving an outlet for the creativity. I think we never want to stop giving our kids these creative outlets. Yeah. That's why when our oldest asked if she could have a tablet on the bus, I said, no, but you can have a journal and a pen, you know? And now plays have emerged and poems and songs and drawings and this and that. So always just giving your children these outlets to express the creativity, and even things like the Tooth Fairy or Santa, like partner with your child in it. Get them to imagine all these worlds. Get them to like think about what they wish would happen. Like it's magical. So I think.
What do you think the Tooth Fairy looks like, and what do they do with the teeth? It's gross.
Well, I remember when I found out the Tooth Fairy wasn't real, it was very early on because I stayed awake so that I could meet the Tooth Fairy, and then surprise, surprise, it was my dad. Pretty sure I scared the shit out of him the one night because it was very late and I was not going to fall asleep until I met that Tooth Fairy. And then my dad walks in to switch out, give me a $1 or something. And I was like, gotcha. And I think my brother was in there too. I think it freaked him right out. But then I got to imagine, he's like, well, now you know, like I'm working with the Tooth Fairy, and well, I clearly knew at that point that my dad was the tooth fairy, but I got to visualize, and I remember just always smirking to myself as a child because they would still pretend the tooth fairy would come, even though I knew it was my dad. And I would imagine my dad coming into the room with like wings on and whatever. And I always thought it was just like a silly visual, and then I would laugh. And so it doesn't mean like the magic is gone just because your child knows it's you. I think it can still be really cool and magical, and then you don't break the trust. So.
I think I kind of want to close this off, but before we do, I want to go back into the question that I've been dying to ask. Okay. So I grew up in a family where I would say we were more deceptive. We were trying to hide what was actually going on internally in the house. We're even told to lie to family and child services when they came a couple times because otherwise we'd be taken away and all that. But now I feel like even then, I don't know. I hate lying. And when I find someone lying to me, it's like the most, I don't know. With our kids, I'm able to deal with it, but I find especially with adults, I'm very untrusting. I feel like most people are deceptive, whether they mean to be or not, but specifically the ones who are deceptive for personal gain, it like enrages me.
So here's a question. I don't think I've ever asked you this. What was it like to be a child and be told to lie?
Well, I mean, the family and child services thing was the one time where I distinctly remember it, but I don't remember what I was feeling at that. I think I was more scared, like, they're telling us we're going to be taken away. You're going to be taken away. And so I was more terrified by that. So then I'm more inclined to be like, yeah, everything's perfect here. And I think it was just kind of ingrained in us. Don't tell anyone what's going on in the house. And I think we did it so well that when we finally, like in our community, said, hey, this is actually what's going on, people were like, there's no way that's possible. There's no way that is true because whatever, I guess we hit it so well.
Yeah, that's why I remember, we can cut all this if you don't want to talk about it, but I remember even when we were dating and coming into your home from a place that was very honest, and then now being brought into like the lies that your family had, and being told I had to keep these secrets, which I'd never had to really keep a secret from anyone before, even from my own parents. And I remember how conflicting that felt, right? Like you want to be honest, you want to talk about your experiences, and you want to tell people these really hard things that you're going through. But then at the same time, you're being told like you have to hide it and you can't tell anyone, because if you do, it'll threaten the whole family system and like everything will break down. And I feel like for you, even into our marriage, like the first few years, we still felt we had to hold up those lies that were a part of the family system. And I think it was the most powerful thing you ever did when you decided, when that time happened, that you weren't going to do that anymore.
Right. Well, and I wonder, maybe my desire for truth everywhere else is my way of like, I don't know, not making up for it, but just making sure that it exists everywhere else.
I think two things. I think when you first started being honest, that was one of the most healing things that ever happened to you.
Yeah.
And you started, like, I remember the first time you told a friend, like, what actually happened in your childhood. Like, that was really a huge deal for you at the time. Mm-hmm. Like, and I remember specifically, you're like, I'm going to go out for coffee with him, and I'm going to tell him. And that was like the first time you had ever really told anyone the truth.
Yeah.
So I feel like now you're the most honest person I know, but I feel like there's a piece of that like the truth is very liberating for you. Like,
yeah. But would you not agree though that outside of my experiences from growing up, I'm very honest about everything, almost to like kind of to a fault at times, where I would prefer we just speak truthfully.
It's because you don't have the people pleaser aspect.
You think that's all it is?
No, I think it's way more than that. But I think that's the difference between you and I. It's like, not that I am prone to lying, but I am more like, I'll try and keep the peace and
Yeah.
I'll try and, but you don't have that.
It's like that whole thing we've talked about, I think, on other episodes. I hate the shit sandwich because I don't like someone telling me, I really like this about you. This is what I'm actually thinking, but I do really like this other thing about you. It's just tell me the thing that you don't like and let's just get on with it. Whether or not it hurts my feelings is sort of like, I would rather just know and then we find a way to move past it.
But I wonder if you're a little more resilient in terms of people hurting your feelings, because it's like you've been so deeply hurt for so many years of your life that it just doesn't affect you the same way.
The benefits of trauma.
Yeah, the
Am I right?
benefits of trauma. I feel like you're not quite so fragile. But what I was going to say about, like, in terms of dealing with other adults lying or even their kids lying, I feel like for you, because you grew up in a family that hid so much and probably had to, like, lie a lot of the time, when you find out that someone's been lying to you, it automatically puts everything in their character in question. Mm-hmm. I think because then you're like, well, if you're lying to me about this one thing, what else are you lying to me about? And now I can't trust you at all.
Yep.
Right? So I think even if you get a sense...
And honestly, the thing is, some people are like that, and they have proven to, like, that everything they were saying was a lie. So then you have enough of that. Like, I had that...
You have enough evidence of that.
I had all the evidence growing up, and then I have a few instances of those with other adults we've worked with or whatever.
So it makes it very hard then to trust.
Yeah.
And I think your lack of trust obviously comes from, like, not having that when you were a kid, but then also, like, a lot of lies in your home and, like, not knowing what was true or not true. So of course you're going to have a hard time trusting adults to begin with. Mm-hmm. And then I think the second you get, like, there's not that honesty there, it pretty much breaks down, like, instantly. And I think that's why, in a way, I think we have such good communication because, well, A, I feel like I'm a very honest person. Yeah. But B, I think you trust me because even if the truth sucks and I'm like, hey, Scott, I totally messed this thing up, or I'm so anxious, I'm pretty sure I got 15 speeding tickets, which didn't actually happen, but I was worried about it. I'll just tell you.
Yeah.
And I think that's why you were able to trust me, and you are learning to trust other people too.
Yeah. I was actually just having the same this is funny because I feel like we didn't purposely do this, but I was just having the same conversation with a buddy of mine recently. Mm-hmm. Because we were just talking about lying and that whole... I don't know. That's funny, actually.
Yeah.
I don't think I meant to have that conversation with him.
I don't think we meant this to get into, like, a deep life chat about trust, but it makes sense.
No, but as I was putting together all of these questions related to a child lying, I just remember as a child having to lie. Mm-hmm. And then a teacher was like, with... one of my siblings was like, some of these things seem very odd. And then we had Family Child Services come out to us. And then we were, like, literally directed to lie to them. So all of this was just kind of coming up as I was thinking of all these questions. Like, why is it that I come from a childhood of so much lying to, I feel like I am... yeah, like I said, the most honest person you could find. And it probably puts people off just because I am more direct about things.
Yeah, people aren't necessarily used to that. They're used to a little more candy coating and a little more. And I feel like that's what I have learned from you, especially in the last few years, is that doesn't always help the situation, right? Not that I was lying, but I think sometimes people pleasing can kind of teeter into that territory of... being not fully truthful in order to keep the peace, right?
People are worried about, which, I mean, is fair enough, but people are worried about others getting upset if you tell them the truth.
Yeah. And you learn over time, at least I feel like this has been a real eye-opener for me over the last few years, that honesty is just so much better. Like, it's better to just have an honest conversation and say, like, hey, I'm feeling this way about something, and then deal with it back and forth, than try and people please and the other person's people pleasing. And then you get into this mess where no one's actually being fully truthful. Anyway, that's like lying as an adult. I think it often comes in the form of people pleasing and pretending things are okay when it's not, or pretending you're a certain way when you're with someone, but then that's not actually the truest version of yourself.
Yep.
I feel like you know the cost, and you know internally in your body how terrible it feels to do that, because as a kid you had to pretend to be one way, and I think this is your way of never getting back in that scenario.
Yeah.
And that's why you're such an honest person. And that's why sometimes your honesty gets you into, not necessarily into trouble, but maybe hit someone the wrong way, because people just aren't used to that. And
And I feel like for us, especially, let's say, building this business, we're trying to surround ourselves with people that aren't going to just be telling us something we want to hear, or I've found that we're trying to make sure we're working with honest people. We're trying to be friends with honest people. I don't know.
and I don't want this to come across like that you're mean, which you're not. Like,
No, I just like honesty. I don't know.
You're just honest.
Is that a mean thing?
No. But like, I feel like it could be taken like, oh, Scott's always honest. Does that mean he's always like telling people things that he hates about them? Like,
No.
It's not that. It's not that. It's more like, I feel like, for example, if you're having a bad day and your friend texts you, how are you feeling? I feel like you would just tell them straight up, like,
Yeah.
this is what happened today. Like, there's no like, yeah, no, it's good. Or like beating around the bush. Oh, it wasn't the best. Like, you'd just be like, yeah, today sucked because of X, Y, and Z, or whatever. Like, I just feel like, and people sometimes like, oh, I wasn't expecting you to actually answer that. That's more what we're talking about than you just being like, I hate your sweater. Like, that's not the type of honesty we're talking about. Well, although you would probably say that to me if you didn't like my sweater. Which, by the way, do you like my new sweater?
Is it lying to say no comment?
Here we go. I was going to ask you this, and this is the perfect time.
The reality is, if you buy something new and you ask, what is your opinion on this? I will tell you whether or not I think it works.
Yeah.
And often you don't love the answer.
No.
Just saying.
Sometimes I have to tell Scott that I don't want his honest feedback.
Yeah. Give me sometimes Jess has to tell me, give me the feedback that I want to hear in this moment.
That's what I'll say if I actually don't want to hear his honest opinion, because I've already made up my mind on something. Anyway, we got deep.
Yeah. Anyways, I just wanted to end with that because
It's a light note.
I don't know. As I was putting together these questions, like I said, I found it very interesting that the childhood that I came from and everything that I grew up with, I am very much, I don't know, I feel like the opposite of. So, anyways.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's a protective factor. I think it makes a lot of sense.
And then on top of that, just seeing our kids and wanting to make sure that they're honest while ensuring at the same time they are as creative as they can be. Because I feel like creativity is one of the most important things in life. Makes life enjoyable, being creative.
Yeah, and I feel like we didn't get into too many tips on how to deal with lying today, which is fine. Like, we could go over that in another episode maybe. We also do cover that in the Parenting Little Kids course. Like, I talk about lying and how to respond inside that course if people wanted more specifically on lying, because I know I get a lot of questions on it.
Yep. Okay, sounds good.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in today. And definitely let us know if you have any comments or questions. I feel like we could go a whole other episode just on like the deeper trauma type stuff that happens with lying.
Sounds enthralling.
I'm sure. People love to hear about your trauma. No, just kidding. But
about my trauma?
No, not just your trauma. But. All right. We'll talk to you again next week. Hey, thank you so much for being here and listening to this episode today. It means the world to us to have you here. If this conversation was helpful for you, it would mean a lot if you could like and subscribe. That just shows us if the conversation is meaningful and helpful and helps it get out to more people. Also, I just wanted to let you know that every week we have a new episode drop. And if you want to be notified when that happens, just hit the little bell icon. Again, thank you so much for being here, and we'll talk to you again next week.